discussion, I think is a bit crazy.
Yeah.
Continue. Who's recording this?
Yeah, I see that too.
For sure.
And this is about to be said to the Vice Chancellor, Rod, because we've just recorded what you've just said.
Yes, I know.
Okay. We're going to announce
record, by the way, Rod.
Yeah. Oh, here's your Ray.
Okay. What do I have to do? What do I have to do to upload my slides?
Upload the slides.
You're going to share your screen. So go on to the.
It says that it's deactivated.
I
The
did.
host
Hey,
deactivated.
everybody.
Oh, that's not a good sign.
All right. Okay.
Okay, that looks good.
Yeah.
We anticipated every possible problem except this one.
Oh.
I was the guinea pig Wednesday.
So you should be able to do it now.
Yeah, I'll try.
Yeah.
So that's.
Yeah.
There
Good.
we go.
Excellent.
Excellent.
I just have to. Oh yeah. Okay, very good.
Very nice. So who's the lead author here? Is it Michael or you, Tim?
So far, it's Michael.
Alphabetical, Michael. 50-50 always.
So is this going to be like a tag team presentation, or just yourself will be speaking, Tim?
No, it's mostly me, I think. Michael would just step
Mostly.
in when I tell some nonsense.
Oh, well, all you.
All right, so I think we have another few minutes, so we might just wait to see if others are going to be joining. Can we see how many people are in the meeting? So we've got 16 people present. Just a few formalities before we start. This is obviously our first Zoom seminar for the department, so thanks everyone for joining. It'll be the same time schedule, so it'll be an hour and 15 minutes. Slight difference in that if we could just request that you ask questions, reserve your questions to the end, unless you have a sort of clarification question, in which case feel free to raise your digital hand, or you can just sort of interject, I guess. But the other point to note is that the video is being recorded, so if you're uncomfortable with that, feel free to turn off your screens. And that's probably about all we have to say in terms of the formalities. Just like to welcome Tim. I'm not sure that I need to introduce him too much. Tim has been visiting the department since the start of semester and is teaching public economics. And I see some of his students are joining us today, which is very nice. So Tim, as you well know, is a professor in political economy. He's based in Freiburg in Germany at the Albert Ludwigs University. His area of expertise is sort of in, I guess, research themes are in sort of three areas: institutions, migration, and conflict. Conflict being the topic of today's presentation. I'll hand it over to you, Tim. So looking forward to your presentation today. Looks like a fascinating sort of topic. I'm very intrigued to see where this data came from. So look forward to the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. Thanks for giving me this opportunity to do the first Zoom research seminar. That's very, very kind. And yeah, I mean, I would love to be around in Perth now rather than being at home in Freiburg. But yeah, the German government told me very clearly that it's now time to get back to Germany. And so I followed the advice of my government. I don't know whether it was a good idea, but now I'm here and happy that all this technical stuff works and that I can give at least my presentation now. Yeah, this paper is as Michael said, joint work with Michael Yetter, and we just basically started. We have some I think very nice empirical results, and we're a little bit lacking of, of the background story, and I'm currently working on that. And I will show you what we have so far. So this is still work in progress, and we're very much looking forward to your comments, because we really think that we have some nice results, but of course we need some critical comments to see whether our story is convincing. And so your comments are most welcome. Well, the topic of the talk is supernatural beliefs and conflict, and it's basically a project that started out from a different perspective. Initially, Michael and I were thinking about working on the effect of religion on terrorism, and we figured out that this is quite difficult to work on because of many obstacles that are related to that. But we both had the feeling that there is certainly a huge gap in the literature about this question of whether we really see an effect of religion on conflict. And so we started thinking a little bit more about this, and we ended up with this topic here. And I will show you basically what the starting point then is, and what we want to ask in more concrete terms. So the starting point basically is that we've seen over the past centuries a lot of wars around the world that have somehow been related to religion. And there is this claim that religion causes war. So we're not just saying that religion may cause terror or terrorism, but that we broaden the perspective in a sense by looking at the question of war. There are these wars in the Middle Ages, the Crusades, the European wars of religion in the 16th and 17th century, including the German Peasants' War in the early 16th century, the 30 Years' War, of course, and so on. So there are many cases or examples of wars that have been labeled as religious wars, and that continues until today to the war on terror, which is a war, well, not really a war, but which has been claimed to be a war that resulted from Islamist terrorists attacking Western, mostly Christian countries. There is also a different way of looking at this. There is in the Catholic religious law, there is a couple of notions of wars that have a divine mandate. One of the earliest cases is stated in the Decretum Gratiani from the 12th century, where it says Deo auctore bella, so wars originated by God, or in a different translation, wars with a divine mandate. So there's a lot of, or a strong narrative basically arguing that religion is closely related to war and maybe causes war. But the question that, of course, comes up from an empirical point of view is whether we can really say that religion causes war or has caused war in the past. And this is actually a question that has been debated controversially since antiquity, basically. And so this is really something that is in the literature in many fields. And the big issue here is, of course, that, as I said, from an empirical point of view, that there are really severe endogeneity issues. One big problem is about the measurement of the variables that people have to look at, and most strikingly, this is about religion. So what exactly is religion? How do we measure religion? Is it the number of churches? Is it the number of people who pray? Is it the number of members of a church? I mean, that are variables that we sometimes use in the literature today, and they are highly disputed. And this is even more a problem, of course, in the past. we also have problems of reverse causality, because we know that many wars have an effect on religious feelings. There was this famous quote by a preacher with a nickname Woodbine Willie from the First World War, who stated in the beginning of the First World War that now we see a run on the bank of God, meaning that the churches were full of people praying for a good outcome of the war, later for peace and so on. Also, we have effects on if these are wars that are between different ethnic groups with different religious denominations. If one side basically wins this war, there should be an effect on the distribution of people from these different religious denominations and so on. And there is, of course, a big issue about omitted variables in historical data. Basically, there's hardly any useful data on a larger scale in the databases, and that of course poses another very, very big problem that we have to deal with. So it's actually more or less an idea to work on this that is kind of hopeless, but we said we want to kind of tackle this indigeneity problem by asking a relatively narrow question that is, however, related to this big picture. And the question that we are asking is whether religious beliefs, and specifically beliefs in the supernatural, can lead a society to wage a war. And why do we want to look at beliefs in the supernatural or supernatural beliefs? The reason is that many supernatural phenomena in past times were seen as divine signs or omens or wonders. And as you will see, we will look at solar eclipses later on. And so if you look in the literature, in the classical literature, there's, for example, this one quote by Augustine of Hippo from the 4th and 5th century, who was trying to explain what a wonder is. And wonders are such things that include the eclipses of the sun and moon, some kinds of stars that appear only rarely, earthquakes, monstrous birth of living things, and such things. None of these occur without the will of God. And this is something that, or this way of looking at those supernatural phenomena is quite common, and it continues over many centuries until the modern times. And so we think that looking at those supernatural phenomena might be a way of tackling this issue of that we maybe have some problems in defining exactly what religious beliefs are. So let me tell you a little bit more about this. First of all, about the combination or the interactions between religious beliefs and the supernatural. There are basically two important aspects here about supernatural phenomena. One is a psychological aspect. The belief in the supernatural helps to deal with uncertainty. That's at least what the psychologists are saying. And this is something that we see until today, which is still very common. Today we have a lot of superstition. We have surprisingly high rates or numbers of people that believe in angels and so on. If you look at today's data, you will see that it's 30 or 40% of the population, for example, in the United States, that actually think that there are angels around. And so we still have this belief that in uncertain situations, we may be able to rely on the support by those supernatural beings, like, as I said, angels and so on. There is a second thing that has been pointed out by, especially by ethnologists, who argue that supernatural agents promote prosociality. And how is this done? Well, it's mostly because it is possible to basically point at the possibility of a punishment if people do not cooperate in a social setting. Meaning that basically there are some religious leaders saying, okay, if you don't do this or that in our little community, then there will be a punishment from this supernatural agent. So this has a very important societal function, and today's levels of cooperation are partly being explained by this kind of threat of punishment through the supernatural agents. And if you put this together, what you see, especially in folk religion, is that there is some kind of deification of certain phenomena that you see, or of crises such as diseases, droughts, unexpected death, repeated accidents, and again, solar eclipses and strange events. That's what Hebert and Shaw are saying, and that with this kind of deification, you have this explanation for what's actually going on, why there is this disease or solar eclipse or whatever that has not been expected, that was unknown or surprising for the people. And then you can basically start to work on this. Then you can come up with common rituals, for example, to remedy these crises, and so on. So this is basically the combination of these two things. And what we therefore propose now is that we want to use one of these supernatural occurrences or events, namely solar eclipses, to instrument religious beliefs, and then use this to explain war, what is our actual intention. There is one famous example in the literature, and I'm sure that we find more of these examples, but one is really, really famous for various reasons, including the claim that this guy Thales was able, or was the first person able to predict solar eclipse. It's the eclipse of Thales from 585 BC, which actually led not to war, but to peace. So there were two groups of people, the Lydians and the Medes, in today's Middle East region. So Herodotus writes that, so when the Lydians and Medes saw the day turn to night, they stopped fighting and both were more eager to make peace. So this is something that has been related in many, many sources to a solar eclipse that really had this kind of effect on the war. It came so surprising to the people on the battlefield that they saw it as a sign and stopped their fighting, basically. So this is one famous example. There are other famous solar eclipses in history, which are in one way or the other related to certain behavior responses by political leaders or in the population, and so on. And so basically, this is the background to our story, and what we then do is that we to describe our idea of the paper, that we start out with this basic question: okay, do religious beliefs lead countries to enter a war? We argue that it is especially the kings and dukes or whatever, are nobles that want to enter wars with divine support. And solar eclipses can be seen as a good omen. And so it is something that may therefore support this idea of going into war. I mean, it's a situation of uncertainty. You don't know what the outcome of the war will be. you don't really know when to start, and therefore, if there is a good omen, this could be helpful. It could also, of course, be a slightly different story if you have some motivational or collective action problems in your population. People don't really want to go to war. You could basically argue that solar eclipses might be, or that the solar eclipse is this kind of divine signal that tells you now it's the right point in time to enter a war.
If you don't mind, why are you focusing on solar eclipses and not, say, for example, lunar eclipses, when there's quite a lot of evidence to show that conflict is related also to lunar eclipses? For example, the siege of Constantinople in 1453, which was finished with a blood moon.
You're right. We could probably do that. The point with the solar eclipses is they do not occur so often, and they are basically seen only in a very small area, and so it is something that I mean, the point is basically, even if there are, for example, clouds, you would still see this effect of the solar eclipse. Okay, so you can really pin that down if it's a total solar eclipse, and we're looking at total solar eclipses. While during the night, this is not so clear, and there are other occurrences of the moon, like a blood moon or so, that is, I mean, that's not an eclipse, but just the opposite in a sense, which is also very impressive. But what is so special about the solar eclipses is it is very often mentioned in the literature. It is relatively rare, and the religious feelings that come with it seem to be even stronger. And so this is kind of the most conservative measure that we have. But of course, it would probably be possible to also come up with the data for lunar eclipses. Yeah.
Team, just clarification. So in terms of war, you don't distinguish domestic war or cross-border war, right?
You will see in a second what kind of data we are using. This is cross-border war.
Cross-border war, okay.
Yeah, it is cross-border war. We always have one country basically that is starting the war against another country. Okay, so this is what comes out of the data set. It is very difficult to say what's happening within the different countries, and therefore we don't really have historical records of that.
Because internally, often different religions lead to internal wars, right?
Yes, that's definitely true, and there is some literature also from more modern times, for example, from the Islamic world, where civil wars are being fought over, or where you can really see the effect of religion on civil wars between different groups within the Islam, or between the Islamic parts of the population and the Christians and so on. That's certainly something that would be interesting, but we don't really have data on that. It's, I mean, this is already quite difficult to come up with a reasonable data set for wars between countries. And if you look at the subnational level, it's getting even more messy.
Can I ask a question about, just a clarification also about semantics here? I mean, what you're really discussing here is superstition rather than religion, right? So you need a link. If you're going to tell a religion story, you need a link between superstitious behavior, which may be associated with an eclipse, which might go back to the Stone Age, right? You know, that it's not necessarily linked one way or the other to organized religion of one form or another. Is that so? Or, I mean, do you have a way to link this back to the question of religious denomination?
Well, what we are looking at is only Europe, so it's only Christians. So the only event basically that we have that is relevant with different denominations would be between the Protestants and the Catholics, and some of the wars are actually related to that. What we try, of course, to do is to argue that our you call it superstition. We would still say it's the belief in supernatural phenomena, but I mean this is obviously closely related. And what we basically try to do is to really establish this kind of link. There is a lot of literature from other fields that is suggesting that people think of this as really a matter of God. God basically sending out a signal through a solar eclipse, and it comes really surprisingly to the people. I will show you one or two more examples on the next slides, how people were thinking about this. But it is so far the point that we still need to put a lot of additional work in, really to make it convincing that there is this link between solar eclipses as one very, very prominent example of looking at supernatural phenomena and religion. And I would say we can do that, but we need obviously more evidence for that from the literature, I guess.
Can I just add something real quick? I think, Rod, I think your point is exactly right. We need to be very careful in describing what element of religion it is. What is a very common element, I think, of virtually all religions is supernatural beliefs of some form. I think that's fair to say. But then that's, of course, not coupled with particular religious denominations we cannot speak to. Particular religious organization like the Vatican or so we cannot speak to. But the element of religion that we do capture is that of supernatural beliefs that is highlighted with a solar eclipse. I think that's the closest, or that's the safest thing we can say. Now, how you extrapolate that to a religious organization or to religious denominations is not clear at all. So we can't make any statements there. But what we can say is that if supernatural beliefs elicit religious beliefs, at least to some degree, then we can test for a link between religious beliefs and war.
So you're saying that these natural phenomena or solar eclipse is written down in those religious teachings. So it's up to, it's not up to some authority of religion to interpret those phenomena. It's just like, it's clearly everybody's seen those religious teachings says that, okay, this is a solar eclipse, that means something. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, that's right. I mean, this is people. Everyone is basically observing this, so you don't really need to have it written down. You don't need people to understand what's written down in the Bible or wherever. I mean, it is in the Bible. So I mean, you see, with the crucifixion of Jesus, there was exactly the story. But I actually forgot to put that on the slides. But it says basically. On the day of the crucifixion of Jesus, there has been a solar eclipse. Okay, so it starts at noon, and then the sun goes down basically, or the light goes down, and it returns only by 6 in the afternoon or so. And
well, so, I mean, the reason I ask is because I don't know Catholics or Protestants. But in some like Asian religions, like when people see natural phenomena, they have no way as to how to interpret. Then they oftentimes have to resort to religious leader to interpret those natural phenomena.
Yeah, I mean that gives you, of course, the opportunity to use that strategically if you want. But what is typical, I would say, is that people tend to interpret these observations as a signal from God. What kind of God that is, I could also be more than one God. But this is a very typical thing, and as Michael said, I mean, this is what we do see in the literature quite a lot, that there is this link between those supernatural phenomena and religion. And so that's the link that we want to stress here.
Jim, can I also just quickly ask a question? Sorry, Tim.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm missing something. I mean, presumably in the past, there was almost everybody 100% were religious. There wouldn't be many in society that would not be. And so I don't know that I understand where some of your variations going to come from, but maybe that'll come later on in the paper.
Well, yeah, the variation comes from the fact that this path of the solar eclipse is very narrow. Okay, so that is, you will see the solar eclipse only in small parts. I will show you that in a second, in a very small band, basically. And so it's only a very small number of countries that has been affected by one solar eclipse. And therefore we do have a lot of variation here. So and what we look at is the capitals of countries, because we say or argue that the political leaders, the kings or whatever that is in that case, they reside in the capitals. And so if there is a solar eclipse that you can see in a certain capital, then this is what we are looking at. Okay, so Chris, did you have a question?
Can I ask one?
Good. Yeah, sure.
Sure. I think Michael McClure also has one. But so if I understand it correctly, your argument is that superstition will affect war, and like you're instrumenting superstition with solar eclipse paths. But could it also be that superstitions affects a lot of other activities, right? I mean, countries might go into celebration of some sort. Economic. So if they have a religious leader, they might introduce new economic reforms, and that's what happens. It makes the country more vulnerable to war. A country which seizes this opportunity attacks. Right? Can that be possible?
This could, of course, be the case, but what we have in the data is that we can look at basically the country that attacks and the country that is being attacked. And we see only an effect for attacking countries and not for the ones that are being attacked. So that is, I think we can rule out that empirically.
Well, it's sorry, but it's
Michael
it's
had
a
a question.
effect. It's a smaller effect for the ones that are attacked, just to clarify. Much smaller.
Yeah, okay, it's a small effect, yeah.
Michael
Sorry,
also has a question. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll be very brief. I think you need to differentiate between the pre-Enlightenment world and the post-Enlightenment world. This is where Rod's observation between belief and superstition is very important. There's a very comfortable relationship between scientific knowledge and belief in the post-Enlightenment world that didn't exist prior to it. And the periods we're looking at are pre-Enlightenment. So it may make perfect sense in that world period, or if we're to look at it in the current sense, the idea of superstition as opposed to belief is, I think, important. So how you interpret the results, whether it's general throughout history or particular to the pre-Enlightenment period, is, I think, important. Thanks.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I will show you some results on that. I mean, I just sent Michael an email yesterday saying that we also probably need to look a little bit more on the time trends and show them in the tables. But you're absolutely right that this is something that matters here. And I will show you I think it's actually already the next slide. But the ability to predict solar eclipses in Europe, I think that's a very important point. Because I mean, this relates very much to the question of what people can expect in terms of or what we can expect in terms of what people were actually interpreting, or whether they were surprised to see a solar eclipse. Because as long as they are surprised, it's very likely that they start this kind of deification in this respect. So looking back, I mean, this is what I did the last couple of days, that I tried to figure out what the ability to predict solar eclipses was in Europe in the last 1 or 2,000 years. And it's actually quite interesting to see that we have basically during the dark ages of medieval times, we are basically seeing that that Europe is losing most of the knowledge that existed in antiquity about astronomy. And only in the late 13th century in southern Spain, there was still this Islamic influence. And there was one king who started to let astronomic works from the Islamic world translate into Castellan. And so the outcome of this was the so-called Alphonsine tables. And these tables were being used to calculate the position of the moon and the sun relative to some fixed stars. And these kinds of tables were very, very important to be able to make predictions. But what we see then is that until the year 1600 something, 1608 or 10 or 12, depends a little bit on what kind of telescopes you're looking at, but that was the time when the telescope was inhibited. And there are only 7 astronomers known to work on issues like solar eclipses in this area. They were actually quite good, but it was only a very, very small number of people working on that, including Copernicus, by the way. And so their knowledge was basically, if at all, shared among this small group of scholars and was given to some kings and dukes who were sponsoring this kind of astronomic research. There was one guy, Tycho Brahe, who was sitting on a little Danish island, basically, and he was really, really good. I mean, he was able to predict a solar eclipse within an error margin of only 10 minutes. And so he was the leading guy of that time. But except for the Danish king, no one knew basically of his existence, and only later it was seen how good he actually was. And then until roughly 1650, and with the invention of the telescope, the number of astronomers increased. Kepler was the next important guy here. And then we are getting around 1650 relatively accurate predictions, which have been known also to more people than just these very small group of scholars. But still, the knowledge was shared mainly among the researchers and the sponsors from nobility. And what we then see is that only in the 19th century, solar eclipses became something really popular, especially in England. There were societies that have been founded that were organizing public lectures, that were sponsoring expeditions to India and other places in order to observe solar eclipses. And only in that time, around 1850 or so, this issue of solar eclipses became really popular. So by looking at the area 1400 to 1800, we are still in an area where we see a lot of research that is only being done for a very small number of people. And most people are still kind of surprised when they see this. And even after that time, you find a lot of evidence that people feel something divine in solar eclipses. There is this Austrian writer, Adalbert Stifter, who wrote about the 1842 solar eclipse. Let it not be protested that the matter is, of course, natural and easy to calculate from the laws of bodily motion. The wonderful magic of beauty that God imparted to things asks not for such calculations. It is there because it is there. Truly, it is there in spite of calculations. And you see a lot of this kind of writing saying basically, well, I don't care that this is this can be explained rationally, it's still something that I think is divine. Okay, so and I mean these were well-educated people that were writing this kind of stuff. For most of the people, I would say it was still in the 19th century difficult to understand what's really going on, and that makes us kind of confident that that it's not just it's not necessarily something that already starts with the Enlightenment to change, but it changes only in the 19th century. And so by looking at the time until 1800, we think we are on the safe side with respect to this kind of public knowledge. Okay, now let's now talk a little bit about the results, or about the data first. So what we see here is basically the first of our two main data sources. This data on solar eclipses comes from the 5 millennium canon of solar eclipses database. It is a very, very simple tool that has been used quite frequently. It's today with a computer power, not a difficult thing to calculate exactly the path of a solar eclipse. You see on the upper right-hand side total and annular solar eclipse paths for the last 20 years. And what you see is it is typically a very small band that we look at here. If we look at Europe, what we do in our analysis, you see that there is basically one solar eclipse, one annular eclipse running through Europe, through Spain mostly, and otherwise in this kind of graph that we have here, you see that it's really some places that are being affected and others that are not being affected. And that's what we use here as a variation. So we have the coordinates of the capitals of European countries that enter a war in this time period, and then we can calculate exactly how many total annular, hybrid, and partial solar eclipses occur in this time period. And so what we do is we look only at total solar eclipses in the results that I'm going to show you, but it works also if you include other types of solar eclipses. So
two very quick things. First, if the most solar eclipses are going through Spain, and the first 100 years of your data set, the Spains are basically under Moorish control, you do have an Islamic state. That's a bad turn of phrase. You do have a geographical body where the majority of people adhere to Islam, and I've just Googled it, but during a solar eclipse in Islam, it is everyone prays, and it is a day of peace, and everyone praises Allah. So that would seem to be a very different entity, especially if it's treated more often than the remaining countries of Europe. And the second thing, sorry, clarifying, is Constantinople in your sample?
Oh, that's a good. The second one is a good question, and maybe Michael can answer it. I don't really know exactly. I mean, I will show you on the next slide that we already have a big issue with the Holy Roman Empire and how to cope that. With regard to Islamic Spain, I mean, what we look at is only Madrid, which was not under Islamic leadership. So that kind of avoids that problem. But you're right in the sense that this is, of course, something that happened. Yeah. And Constantinople, I would have to check that. I don't remember.
I just checked. It's not in there. No,
it's not in there.
Okay. But we stopped there.
All right.
Okay. Okay. About the conflict data, we use conflict data from the conflict catalog, violent conflicts 1400 AD to the present in different regions of the world. It's compiled by Peter Brecke. And we just look at the part of this data set that is on continental European countries. One of the big problems is that the list of countries is continuously changing over time. Some countries are there and then they disappear because they have been conquered or whatever. Some countries pop up newly, and so we had to come up with a solution for that. As I said, we are just looking at the coordinates of the capitals, because the argument is that in these capitals, the political decisions are being made. So it's important, basically, that the solar eclipse can be seen in the capital. And then, yeah, as I said, the Holy Roman Empire did not have a single capital. The capital was changing over time. So we coded that towards the countries that followed from the Holy Roman Empire, or we used the Holy Roman Empire as one unit, basically. And the first named country in this Brecke list is the aggressor. There is a second list by Peter Brecke, which goes back to 800. We also tried to code that. And this, however, we are very, very, worried about the quality of that kind of data. And so, I mean, we also, it doesn't really change the results if we look at that kind of list, but we're feeling better about our results if we use this list that starts in 1400. What you see from our very, very small table of summary statistics is that we have, on average, about 13% of the country year observations with the total solar eclipse, and we have conflicts on average in 27% of these observations. And we have a total of 19,000 observations in the list.
Can I ask a question? Sorry.
And also, can I jump in? Tim, do you have a measure for the intensity of the conflict, and how is sort of violence defined? Is it, these are just dummy variables, obviously, but do you have a measure of the intensity at all?
Yeah, no, we don't have that. I mean, this is, as I said, it's quite difficult to come up with data at all, and so we just know something about conflicts going on.
Can I ask about this classification of countries as aggressor or otherwise? Is that important in your analysis? I mean, it seems to me that we have to be aware here about history being written by the victors in these conflicts. And it's always convenient to define the opposition or the losing party as the aggressor. So there may be biases in those data.
Yes, we are also not totally convinced that the country that is named first here is really the aggressor. And therefore we checked everything. So we basically do not rely much on this notion of the aggressor, but just look at the countries that are being involved.
It is an interesting question, of course. That you know, if there is superstition that is triggered by an eclipse, does that induce aggression, or does it induce passivity and vulnerability, right? I mean, that's an important question here, isn't it?
Yes, that's absolutely true.
Vulnerability that's made obvious then may lead others to be aggressors, right?
Two very brief points. Sorry, you respond to that, Tim. Sorry.
Oh, yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right that we have to be careful at that point. But as I said, I mean, we're basically looking at the fact whether there is a conflict or not. But we somehow try to look, of course, at this aggressor versus a victim issue. And as Michael said before, and I will show you that on one of the next slides as well, we do see that the aggressor variable has this positive effect on a war. So if there is a solar eclipse being observed in the first named country, then we do see this positive effect, and this is far less the case with the victims.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Chris?
Yeah, I'm going to say very quickly. I realise we're killing your time. I'm sorry. First, I go back to all the time you saying that all of Europe was Christian, but large swathes of Europe were under control of the Ottomans during that time. So you've got two major religions. I just wonder if there's differences between the two. And the second thing is, this is also the time when a lot of the universities in Europe were built. Frederick, co-author of mine, has a complete list of all of those. But maybe as a control, maybe have a number of universities or something along those lines as a measure of whether these could be understood or not. I don't know. Just a thought.
And that's an interesting point. I mean, we should look at that. I mean, you're right about this, the Ottoman Empire, and I think we have to look at that a little bit more closely. How this affects the data, or whether we have to take out some of the data in order to see whether there is whether this plays a role for the total effect. The universities, that could actually be something interesting to look at. I mean, we do have time trends that we look at, so we should actually be able to capture most of this scientific progress that is taking place, and which is, of course, also or being reflected in the number of universities in different countries. But maybe, I mean, that could enrich the analysis by looking at this kind of variable. Yeah, thanks. Good point. Okay. Yeah, let's have a look at the data or the results. So we first of all have some very simple graphical representations here. So the first thing that we see here now is conflict incidence in this panel A. And what we see is that there is, in fact, a strong increase, a positive and significant increase in the likelihood of a conflict in the year of the solar eclipse itself. And this effect is still visible in the years after that solar eclipse, but it's clearly strongest in this year of the solar eclipse, and it is not, or it's far less, or the conflict incidence is far less probable in the years before the solar eclipse. So that is first picture that we look at. It's about the conflict incidence. Then we also look at conflict onset.
Tim, just clarification. What do you mean by incidence?
That we do see a conflict in a given year.
Okay, so that's kind of different, because you can have a war that lasts for many years, right?
Yes,
but they belong to the same war. So, in this case, you are just counting the year that has a war, and you don't care about whether that's a different war or the same war.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, but I mean, it nevertheless, in the number of these war incidences goes up in this particular year of the solar eclipse, meaning that we do see simply more conflicts in this period. Yeah.
But that also implies that your observation across time might be related.
In this kind of analysis, yes. But in the next one, where we just look at the conflict onset, we see the same effect, and that's clearly only this case where we have in the period before, in T-1, there was no conflict, okay, and then a conflict shows up for the first time in year T, and year T is basically the year in which the solar eclipse takes place. Okay, and that's what we see in this panel B. We see the strong jump in the likelihood of conflict in the years of the solar eclipse. Okay, and that's something that only occurs in that particular year. In the years thereafter, this effect is again basically insignificant.
Tim, how do you define? Sorry, Girish, go ahead.
Question. So the year that you're defining, is it relative to the exact time at which you observe the solar eclipse, or is it the calendar year?
No, that's the calendar year.
So my issue with that is,
I mean, we have I mean, we would be more precise, of course, with the solar eclipse data, because we can pin that down on a specific day and even a specific time of the day. But the start of the conflict itself is defined only as a particular year. Okay, and we are not able really to pin down all the conflicts by the exact date. Okay, because that's I mean, we
so
know.
It may be the case that some of the conflicts actually started in a year before the solar eclipse, right?
That's my fear, not least because you've got wars like the 100 Years' War, which went on for 116 years, 53 years of which are in your sample.
Yeah, but so let me real quick, that for that we can just control for past conflict, which we'll do in the regressions, and then it's fine. And Girish, to your point, yeah, that's possible that the conflict starts first in the calendar year, and then the solar eclipse comes. But then that we should just see a null effect, right? So if anything, we might underestimate.
Yeah.
Oh no! In this instance, you'll be overestimating if you count a new conflict, for example, in a calendar year.
But how would you explain that the conflict starts and then the solar eclipse starts? Like, how would the solar eclipse starting after a conflict starts as opposed to a normal year? How would that come about?
No, I mean, a solar eclipse will happen because it just happens. It's not related
exactly.
to
That's the point. It's a definition of an exogenous event.
Exactly, but what I'm saying is, if, for example, the eclipse happened sometime in November, and you had a total of 12 conflicts in a year, each happening every month, and you're taking all the conflicts in that year, then you're taking 11 conflicts more than what you actually should attribute to the solar eclipse.
Yep, absolutely. But then I should just have bigger standard errors and everything. No, I mean, how would that be systematically more likely in a year that has conflicts as opposed to a year that doesn't have conflicts?
Yeah, but that is the only reason why I was saying maybe if you can, I don't know if you can, but maybe if you can, the actual time of a year should be defined from a year
we can't with those conflicts. You can't. There's no way.
Yeah.
We've looked through those.
No, I see your point that if it's not systematically related, it shouldn't affect. Yeah.
I mean, you're right, but I don't see how it would systematically bias our results. And we can't be more precise as far as I've seen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, we would probably be able to determine the exact date for some of the conflicts, but for most of them, probably not, because the historical data is just too imprecise on that point. I mean, we just have records for basically saying, okay, there was a conflict from that year to that year, and when exactly it started. I mean, it's even difficult to say when a conflict starts. I mean, does it start with a declaration of war, or has it been started before with smaller types of war activities and so on? That's probably quite challenging and certainly not possible for the entire data set.
So Tim, just before you go on, can you interpret that coefficient in the year of the solar eclipse? Is that, you're talking like a 12-13% increase in the probability of onset of conflict? Is that, it seems pretty big, right? The magnitude of that effect. Yeah, seems big.
Yeah, it is. I mean, we were
believable. That's
we were surprised ourselves that we get so strong effects here. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Okay, so next slide is similar. What we look on the left-hand side at is the change in conflict situation. Okay, so one part of the story was already in panel B. So we had no conflict in the previous period or the period preceding the solar eclipse, and then a conflict in that period. But of course, it could also change in the opposite direction, like in this case of the eclipse of Thales, where you had a conflict in T-1 and no conflict in T. We see the same kind of pattern, but if we look at panel D, we see that this is something that is not really happening. Okay, so there is not really an end of conflicts that happens quite a lot, and we don't see an effect that seems to be or all these effects seem to be insignificant in this graph. Okay, now looking at some regressions, as you see, it's a very parsimonious model in the sense that we just look basically at how total solar eclipses explain our conflict variables. It's simple OLS regressions because we argue that we really have this causal link here due to the exogeneity of the solar eclipses. And you see that constantly, if we look at conflict incidence as a 0-1 variable or conflict onset, we have this highly significant positive effect of the solar eclipse on, as I said, conflict incidence or conflict onset. In column number 3, we also control for the past conflicts that, as was mentioned before. And we look at time trends, linear time trends, squared time trends, the latitude and the longitude, as well as in some specifications also at state fixed effects. We do see that the coefficients sometimes change slightly, but it's always the same sign and the same level of significance here. What we see here is basically further dependent variables. Okay, again, we have the conflict change, we have the conflict end, we have the conflict aggressor, that's this first named country, the incident to people that were, or countries that were attacked, the conflict initiator, and the onset. And what we see is, again, that we have these strong, significant effects in all cases. But what's important to point at is the conflict end. The conflict end, which has, where we see this negative sign of the solar eclipse. So that is really showing that it makes, or that there is not much going on in that respect, that conflict parties, like in the eclipse of Thales, see this sign as something that they should respond to by ending a war. What we also did then is to continue by doing more robustness checks. So we also have a logit estimation now. We deal with this problem of the Holy Roman Empire, where we said, okay, there are these basically, or in the Holy Roman Empire, where it's not really clear where the capital is and whether we should split that up, because the different parts of the Holy Roman Empire, they were partly hostile to each other. So in most of the regressions, what we do is we just use the follower states in their capitals. But here in this case, we basically include the Holy Roman Empire as one individual state. It doesn't change anything, or I should also say that we also use decade fixed effects and state year specific time trends. in some specifications here, but it doesn't really change a lot in terms of our results. It's still the same a strong positive effect of the total solar eclipses on conflict incidence and conflict onset, which we are mostly interested in. Okay, then given that some of you already mentioned this fact that things got more scientific over time, people are probably responding more rationally to the observance of solar eclipses, we also ran some placebo regressions. And what we did there was to look at the last 60 years of conflict from now. So it's 1960 to 2018 that we use here, and we look at the solar eclipses in that time and try to figure out whether they had some kind of effect on conflict incidence and conflict onset. And what we see here is that the effect of the solar eclipses is insignificant. And that's what we would actually expect because people understand what's going on. They can explain solar eclipses scientifically, and they do not assign any spiritual value to these solar eclipses. And so this is what we wanted to see, of course. It just doesn't make much sense to talk about people believing in the supernatural or having this kind of religious beliefs resulting from solar eclipses that follows or that could actually have an effect on conflict. Okay, so this is reassuring for our analysis. And we also have this little robustness check here where Michael did some further placebo, randomly created placebo regressions that we have here. So it's a simulation of 100 placebo regressions to see whether this effect is basically random or not, or whether we would get some other effect than the one that we estimated with some kind of random draw of observations. And as you can see, the first coefficient here, that is the result that we had in our first table, basically, and for all these placebo regressions here, we don't get an effect. Okay, maybe Michael, would you like to say more about that? Or
no, I mean, that's it. We just randomly generate solar eclipses in all of these, and if you do that, as you can see here, it's almost impossible to get that result. So it doesn't seem to be random.
Yeah.
Mm.
Okay, so let me briefly summarize what we have here. We've seen that religious beliefs that we instrument by solar eclipses, total solar eclipses, have on the one hand a positive significant effect on conflict and conflict onset, and it has a negative effect on the end of conflicts. And we claim that because the solar eclipses are strictly exogenous, this conflict-inducing effect is causal. And we do see this effect, however, only for this 1400 to 1800 period when solar eclipses were still considered to be some divine or supernatural sign or omen or whatever. But we do not see this effect in the modern times with better scientific knowledge of solar eclipses. Okay. So that's what we have so far, and as I said, we are open for any comments that help us to improve our story or to make our results more robust.
Yeah, I have one comment, please.
Sure.
So I just Googled it. I found this article in the Indian Journal of Psychiatry, and they study the effect of solar eclipse on mental health. And
Okay.
they found that the solar eclipse oftentimes cause the gravitational change on Earth, and also correspondingly people's hormone level, like cortisol and the prolactin, can change.
Mm-hmm.
And then they found like some patients show some very strange behavioral anomaly immediately after the eclipse. So I'm
yeah.
wondering if it's possible there's a direct effect of solar eclipse on people's mental health, and that could lead to war.
I cannot rule that out. Might
Can you send us that article?
But I mean that just supports our
no, that if that's true, that means you don't have the exclusion restriction.
Yeah. Can you send us that article?
Of course, I will send it in right away.
Cool. Thank you.
Did you also consider the full moon syndrome? That's good. The Asians believe the full moon effect.
Can I?
Many Westerners there.
Can I have a go here?
Go ahead.
Most of these wars take place in medieval times, as you've seen, and the thing that characterizes the medieval times, I think, is that religion is extremely prominent in the state, in statehood, and so then you combine that with the ancient tradition of anytime something people don't understand arises, the medicine man becomes more powerful. Right? So the medicine man can actually make choices. If people are uncertain about things, they look to the medicine man, as we're doing today, right at the moment. Right? So that power can actually be destructive or otherwise. It seems to me, though, that there may be indirect behavioural causes going on here. One is that, and we just heard one from Simon, but another is that if there is a misunderstood event, then confidence falls, and that may mean that agricultural output goes down. Right? That may mean that crops fail. That may mean then that one state becomes more vulnerable to attack by another state. It may not be the fact that people are superstitious, and therefore the religious hierarchy directs the state into war, as the medicine man might. It could be these secondary effects that stem from confidence and therefore influence economic outcomes.
I mean, that's however the good thing about solar eclipses. I mean, they take place only for a couple of minutes, and then basically everything is like it was before. So it's this one short, powerful signal that people receive, but this should not have a strong effect on the economy, on economic outcomes, or other variables. So I'm quite confident that this is probably not the reason. I mean, what?
Hold on a minute, going to war is a big change of policy, right? I mean, if you think that there is a regime here, the choice to go to war is a big change. And it seems to me.
Yes. I mean, yeah, you're right. I mean, the role of the political leader or the advisors, let me call them advisors of the political leaders. I mean, that's something that I'm also still a little bit concerned about. So that could be an issue. I mean, but I'm not sure whether the other problem is I mean, it might simply be that people were waiting for some signal. I mean, they were hesitant to start a war, and then in this receiving this kind of signal, they will then argue, okay, now there is this good omen, okay, and now we are ready to start because we now see that we have this kind of divine support. I would say this is probably part of the story. It's
That's
not
where you need your aggressor versus victim data. Right? Does that show you something along those lines?
Michael? I'm not sure.
So does the eclipse stimulate aggression, or does it stimulate passivity and vulnerability?
Well, so the results are strong. If you go back to the second table, Tim, the results are stronger and larger in magnitude. That one? Yeah, that one. So if you look at column 3, that is when we define the database is the bracket database is that the first named state is supposed to be the aggressor. But they are very careful in saying, look, we can't always 100% identify who was the aggressor, so that is to be considered carefully. But if we do that, if we look at the first named state as the aggressor, then in column 3 you see that the effect
is strong, yeah,
larger than the attacked ones.
Yeah,
so
okay.
That is, I think, column 6, for example, and column 4, and the coefficient is smaller, but it's still there as well. But we don't want to emphasize that too much because it's so hard to define in retrospect. Like you said before, history is written by the winner, so who's
exactly
started the conflict. And even today, if you had to define some conflicts along those lines, at what point does somebody start? Like if the other country violates this and that, is that a start, or when you fire the first bullet? Or so that's a tough decision, especially a conflict in the 15th century.
Agreed.
We've got to be careful with that, I think.
Do you have data on agricultural output, when crops fail and so forth? I mean, is it possible to align data like that with the data on eclipses?
We've not found anything like that. Also, you can't even get population size or any of that in a reliable way at the time. But if you think about it, all of this should be orthogonal to solar eclipses, unless there's a story like you sketched earlier, when the solar eclipse leads to other outcomes in between, before it then leads to a decision of starting a conflict. That is true, but I'm not sure how we could test for that. But even then, actually, the initial starting point would be the supernatural beliefs that are elicited by the solar eclipse. Then the channel might just be through economics or something else, but the outcome is then still conflict, which is still consistent with our main story.
Okay.
I think Emiliano has a question, but Emiliano, your mic is muted, so you might want to switch it on before you ask your question.
Yeah, just quick thing, going back to Giri's question about whether the eclipses occurred before or after the war started. Do you have a graph with the distribution? I mean, you have very good data on when the eclipses occurred. Do you have a graph across month within the year so we can see the distribution of eclipses along the year?
We don't have it yet, but we take this as a good hint to produce some kind of
right. So as long as the eclipses occur evening or during the middle of the year, that would be fine.
Yeah, that's a great point. We can check that.
That's all.
Cool. Thanks.
I would say even this is pretty much random in the sense that if we look at the entire data set, we would see solar eclipses at any time of the year, basically. So this should basically, if we look at the entire data set, this would probably not have a big effect. But it might be for some periods that there is an accumulation of solar eclipses in specific parts of the year. Yeah. But
yeah, maybe it should be the graph conditional on those years that was a conflict.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Great point. Yeah.
Can I just have a query? I found the placebo results compared to the other results very interesting. So I'm just wondering whether there's a big difference in the quality, or in fact the quantity of incidents of war in the placebo sample period. I have in mind that the quality of the data from the 400 years might be so poor that there's only a small fraction of events that are picked up, and yet there's obviously very, very high quality data for the last 60 years, and there may be high numbers of conflicts, including many very low level conflicts, which I'm trying to see whether that would perhaps explain the result. And if not, it's obviously a very important result. But I'm just wondering whether the quality between the 2 years can explain why you get different results for the two periods.
Michael, you can say more about that, I think.
Yeah, data quality. I mean, they had a lot of wars in the 15th to the 19th century, a lot of wars. I think by some estimates, about 90% of all years in every state had a war. It's crazy. But of course, in terms of data quality, that's the best we have. But even Brekke writes in the description that you need to be really careful considering this. I think it's the best list there is for that time, but it's obviously not complete. Yeah.
I suppose intuitively I'm thinking of how many wars per year were there in your 1960-2000 period versus how many wars per year in the period you looked at in the historical period.
Yeah, I can't give you the numbers from the top of my head, but not as many, of course. So that's a good point. Yeah.
I think we have time for one further question from Jan Rui. Would you like to pose a question?
Yeah, just a point. I don't know whether you two have thought about the relationship between state and religion during that particular period from 1400 to 1800. How it evolved over the 400 years. I mean, some countries, the religion stays pretty much identical, right? And then in others, different. Because I'm not so familiar with the European history during that particular time, say the relationship between state and the government, religion.
Well, I mean, there is a close relationship, I would say, in the first 100 or 200 years in our data set, and this one quote from the Catholic law, church law, basically also indicates that there is the possibility, basically, for the church to be an active or an actor in conflict activity, and there is a lot of or that there is a strong role of the church in terms of what the state was doing at that time. At the same time, and this is something that we cannot really catch up here, is we also see conflicts between the church and the different kings and so on, or the different states. And this is often some kind of internal conflict going on, where basically the church has initiated, because of political interest, certain conflicts. They got then connected with some states that were supporting them to run a conflict against some other state. So the church actually plays an important role in these first 100 or 200 years in also initiating conflicts. Later on, I would say, starting with the 17th century, the nation states are more independent of the influence of the church, and I mean, it's still there, especially compared to today, but yeah, I would say it's getting less important over time.
But even I think, sorry, just real quick, but I think we still need to distinguish between, so there could be a state that's very closely influenced by the church, where the church is very powerful, but that's not necessarily representative of what we're looking for, because we have supernatural beliefs, which would be, even if the church was not present at all, supernatural beliefs might still be very strong, because church is a religious organization, And I mean, like the discussion with Rod earlier, religious denominations or religious organizations, we cannot look at. We can just look at supernatural beliefs as a proxy for religious beliefs. I think that's how far we can go. But connecting it to the church or so, I think would be very hard to do. And even if we had that data, I'm not even sure what it would tell us.
With, really, with the religion and the state work together or against each other, so that affects the relationship you identified in your regression. I wonder whether you're able to identify some kind of regime change over the 400 years.
Even if we could, I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's something that maybe don't think about it.
Yeah. I mean, that's the crucial point for us to think about. How, if at all, we can relate it to denominations and religious organizations. So that's a crucial point, I think. Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks everyone. I think we might close the meeting here. Thank you, Tim and Michael, for a fascinating seminar. Hopefully you found the comments beneficial. Certainly adds another dimension with people having Google, you know, on hand. So, so thanks very much, everyone. And next week we'll have Teresa Molina from the University of Hawaii presenting, and Tushar and I will send out the updated seminar list very soon. So look forward to seeing you all next week. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much.
I think it's good, Tim. Actually, you're far away. You're not.
Right.
Yeah, it works very well.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.